The World's Deadliest Prisons, What They're Hiding from You Prison Documentary. Hunger and Shadows, Inside the World's Deadliest Prisons. Subscribe for more true crime documentaries. Every story here is drawn from real events. Hit like and comment to support investigative storytelling. The gates of El Tocaron Prison, Venezuela's notorious penitentiary, swung open at dawn. Outside, the air was heavy with humidity and the faint metallic scent of rusting steel. Guards shuffled along cracked corridors, keys jangling at their belts, while inmates huddled in shadowed corners, their gaunt faces betraying the days without adequate food. According to a 2019 Amnesty International report, El Tocaron was designed to hold 1,200 prisoners but regularly housed more than 4,500, creating a perfect storm of overcrowding, disease, and power struggles. Inside Block C, a narrow hallway led to a shared sleeping area, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs. The floor was littered with tattered blankets and discarded clothing. Inmates spoke in whispers, careful not to attract attention. Many had turned to the prison's informal gang networks for survival. According to Reuters coverage, guards occasionally sold portions of the already meager food supply for bribes, further worsening malnutrition. The air was thick with a mixture of sweat, decay, and desperation, a constant reminder of the imbalance of power. One inmate, identified in reports as Jorge M., pseudonym for privacy, had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days. He navigated the hallway, clutching a makeshift bucket of spoiled rice scavenged from the kitchen. Across the hall, 2 gang leaders held court, negotiating contraband cigarettes in exchange for small portions of protein stolen from the official meal line. According to prison insiders, these informal markets dictated who lived and who endured starvation. Outside observers often compared El Tocaron's conditions to a microcosm of societal collapse, a place where hunger, fear, and authority intermingled dangerously. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Antanimera Prison in Madagascar painted a similarly grim picture. Built to accommodate 500 inmates, the prison held more than 1,200 according to a UN human rights report from 2020. Its open-air cells exposed prisoners to the tropical sun during the day and to cold, damp nights, contributing to a high incidence of respiratory illness and infections. Meals were infrequent and contaminated. A 2019 Reuters investigation revealed that many prisoners relied entirely on family-sent parcels to survive. Malnutrition was rampant, and guards wielded control over every distribution, creating a hierarchy where only those who paid bribes or aligned with certain groups avoided hunger. In Venezuela, reports indicated that El Tocaron inmates often risked their lives for food smuggled through small openings in the perimeter wall. In 2018, a documented incident saw a prisoner sustain serious injuries after falling while attempting to retrieve contraband rice. These incidents were not rare. Rather, they highlighted the lethal intersection of poverty, overcrowding, and systemic corruption. Observers from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, described El Tocaron as a pressure cooker of human desperation, a statement that echoed across multiple reports. Back in Antanimera, the system was failing not just in nourishment but in healthcare. Disease spread rapidly among inmates, often unchecked for weeks. Prisoners suffering from cholera or respiratory infections waited in long lines for minimal attention, according to Amnesty International testimonies collected in 2020. In both prisons, survival was a daily negotiation, an unspoken rule where alliances, bribes, and intimidation determined life or death. By mid-morning, the chaos intensified. At El Tocaron, a fight erupted near the kitchen. According to news reports, the altercation involved a group attempting to seize the last remaining ration of beans, a staple so sparse it had become currency among the inmates. Guards initially hesitated, letting the violence unfold until it escalated beyond control. The scene exemplified the extreme pressure cooker conditions within these high-density facilities, hunger and fear translating into physical conflict. Meanwhile, in Antanimra, a newly admitted inmate, Andre R. pseudonym, described the disorientation of first days behind bars. He observed the older, hardened prisoners moving like predators through the corridors, negotiating food, protection, and information. According to reports from Madagascar prison monitors, younger inmates often fall victim to established hierarchies, being forced into labor or extortion schemes to survive. Those who failed to adapt risked assault, isolation, or worse. Outside these prisons, international observers attempted to intervene. NGOs documented violations, sent aid packages, and filed complaints to local government. However, systemic corruption and lack of resources often rendered these efforts ineffective. Reuters, UN, and Amnesty International all emphasized that these prisons were not anomalies. They were examples of what happens when institutions fail to uphold basic human rights in contexts of poverty and mismanagement. The morning wore on, yet the tension never relented. Guards patrolled mechanically, ignoring the silent negotiations and subtle power plays that governed inmate life. Inmates whispered about bribes, the distribution of leftover food, and the rumored arrival of an international monitoring team, a fleeting hope that often passed without effect. Each corridor, cell, and yard bore witness to the unspoken rules that dictated who would survive and who would endure the slow decay of hunger. As Chapter 1 closes, the cameras catch a brief moment in Block C. An inmate collapses near the kitchen, clutching a half-rotten portion of rice. Another prisoner hovers nearby, uncertain whether to intervene. According to reports, incidents like this were increasingly common, yet rarely documented publicly. The stark reality of El Tocaron and Antanimra begins to emerge. Prisons where control, survival, and corruption intersect in the daily struggle for life itself. Survival, power, and the shadows within. The sun barely pierced the thick concrete walls of La Sabanita prison in Venezuela, a facility infamous for overcrowding and gang violence. Built to hold 1,000 prisoners, according to a 2020 UN report, it housed more than 3,800 inmates. The air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stagnant water, and the faint metallic scent of blood from prior fights. Prisoners had adapted to the chaos, forming strict hierarchies and networks to control food distribution, access to water, and protection. These networks operated almost like shadow governments within the prison, each faction enforcing its own code of survival. Inmates referred to the top-ranking members as PRAN, a term used across Venezuelan penitentiaries for leaders who controlled the flow of resources and enforced discipline among prisoners. According to Amnesty International, the PRAN system effectively made these gang leaders more powerful than prison staff in many blocks. One particularly notorious PRAN, identified as El Tigre pseudonym, leveraged control over kitchen rations to consolidate influence, forcing weaker inmates to perform labor in exchange for scraps of food. Corruption within the guards compounded the problem. Bribes and selective enforcement of rules ensured the prison hierarchy remained intact, leaving little hope for reform from the outside. Meanwhile, in Madagascar's Antanimra prison, tensions had escalated as overcrowding and poor sanitation reached breaking point. Reuters reported in 2019 that the prison had become a breeding ground for disease, with tuberculosis and cholera outbreaks killing dozens annually. The scarcity of basic necessities created conflicts over every resource, from contaminated water to limited portions of rice and beans. Younger inmates quickly learned that survival required alliances, often with older, hardened prisoners who dictated who received protection and who faced assault. In one documented incident, a violent altercation erupted over a water ration, leaving several inmates injured. According to the UN, these fights were symptomatic of the systemic failure to provide humane conditions. Back in Venezuela, reports from 2020 news coverage revealed that gang-led extortion schemes were common even beyond prison walls. Family members were forced to pay bribes to ensure food parcels reached their incarcerated loved ones, a practice that reinforced the prisoners' internal power structures. Guards turned a blind eye, sometimes pocketing portions of the payments themselves. For many inmates, the line between survival and subjugation blurred. Compliance was essential to stay alive, while resistance often invited brutal retribution. In El Tocaron prison, the cycle of violence and scarcity persisted. A fight broke out in the exercise yard over leftover scraps of rice. Guards hesitated, allowing the conflict to escalate into a dangerous brawl before intervention. Amnesty International reports describe this as typical. Overcrowding and malnutrition amplify tensions, with prison staff often unable or unwilling to intervene effectively. Prisoners navigated this environment daily, balancing fear, alliances, and opportunism to secure their basic need. Meanwhile, in Brazil's notoriously overcrowded prisons, conditions mirrored those in Venezuela and Madagascar. According to the Brazilian Ministry of Justice, the average occupancy rate in the country's penitentiaries exceeded 150%, with some facilities surpassing 250% capacity. Inmates in these prisons, particularly in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, were forced to rely heavily on gang-controlled distribution networks for food and protection. Reports from Human Rights Watch detail how organized crime infiltrated daily operations, dictating everything from the allocation of beds to access to medical care. In this environment, the most violent inmates held sway, often leaving the weakest to fend for themselves against both hunger and aggression. As Chapter 2 progressed, it became evident that survival was not just about physical endurance but also mental acuity. Prisoners like André R. in Madagascar and Jorge M. in Venezuela had learned to navigate complex social hierarchies, leveraging alliances and bargaining skills to stay alive. Small gestures, helping an inmate carry water, sharing portions of food, became currency in a world where trust was rare and betrayal common. Every interaction was a strategic move. Miscalculation could lead to injury or death. The international community remained largely powerless. While organizations like Amnesty International, the UN, and Reuters documented the conditions and advocated for reforms, their reports often faced bureaucratic delays and government resistance. Inmates inside these institutions lived daily in a vacuum of accountability, where hunger, disease, and intimidation defined every moment. These prisons were less about rehabilitation and more about survival, an ongoing struggle dictated by power, scarcity, and human resilience under extreme pressure. By the chapter's end, a single, seemingly minor incident hinted at the escalating dangers within. In La Sabaneta, an inmate was found unconscious near the kitchen, reportedly after being denied his bribe to the pran. According to local reports, other prisoners whispered about retribution from the gang leaders, demonstrating how quickly survival could turn to peril. Across continents, the pattern was the same. Overcrowding, corruption, and malnutrition combined to create a lethal environment where every day was a calculated battle. The iron grip, control, and fear behind bars. Subscribe for the most revealing true crime documentaries. Like, comment, and join the investigation into the world's deadliest prisons. The sun had barely risen over ADX Florence in Colorado, the United States' most secure federal prison. Often referred to as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, the facility was designed to contain the nation's most dangerous criminals, from domestic terrorists to high-ranking organized crime figures. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, inmates spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, with extreme surveillance measures designed to prevent any communication with the outside world. Guards monitored every movement, and even routine meals were served through small slots in the cell doors to minimize contact. Inside, the psychological toll was palpable. Inmates like Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, had spent decades in these conditions, illustrating the severe isolation enforced at ADX Florence. While the design prevented physical escapes, it did not prevent mental and social manipulation. According to court filings and investigative reports, some inmates maintained influence over criminal networks outside prison through coded correspondence and lawyer-mediated communication. The prison's stringent security protocols created a sterile environment where every sound echoed, every action was scrutinized, and even the smallest mistake could have grave consequences. Across the globe in La Sabaneta prison, Venezuela, control took a very different form. Here, the PRAN system, described in Amnesty International reports, functioned as an internal government. Prison leaders dictated who received food, medical attention, and protection. Refusal to comply often resulted in violent punishment. The scarcity of basic necessities amplified the power of these inmate leaders. In one documented incident, a newly arrived inmate was beaten for attempting to bypass the gang leader's ration system. Such events were verified in multiple news reports from Reuters and local Venezuelan outlets, showing a brutal hierarchy where authority was maintained by fear and violence. Meanwhile, in Brazil, the sprawling penitentiaries of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro continued to exemplify deadly overcrowding. According to the Brazilian Ministry of Justice, facilities often exceeded 150% capacity. Inmates were forced to navigate highly organized gang territories, where even minor infractions could provoke retaliation. Reports from Human Rights Watch and BBC investigations indicated that certain gangs controlled entire wings of the prisons, dictating daily routines, ration distribution, and access to smuggled contraband. For survival, inmates needed not only physical resilience but also strategic alliances and the ability to navigate volatile social hierarchies. In Angola Prison, Louisiana, the system of survival was similarly ruthless but historically rooted in labor exploitation. Once a working plantation, the prison required inmates to toil in the fields under oppressive heat. Reports from the Vera Institute of Justice highlight that gang influence extended into labor assignments, food distribution, and even cell placement. The infamous Angola 3, who spent decades in solitary confinement for a murder conviction widely criticized as questionable, demonstrated how punishment, isolation, and control intersected to suppress dissent while allowing a few inmates to dominate through fear. Over in Madagascar's Antanimera, daily life continued under unrelenting conditions. Disease, overcrowding, and violence created a cycle of survival where alliances and fear dictated every action. UN reports and Amnesty International testimonies describe how minor disputes over contaminated water or spoiled food escalated quickly into life-threatening situations. Inmates with connections to stronger, older prisoners often survived, while newcomers faced severe punishment for mistakes or attempts to assert autonomy. In Rikers Island, New York City, the dynamic was again different but no less dangerous. According to multiple reports including the New York Times and ACLU studies, gang activity was pervasive, particularly among youth and pretrial detainees. Inmates relied on allegiances for protection, and small altercations over food, cigarettes, or sleeping space could quickly escalate. The death of Caliph Browder in 2015, held for 3 years without trial, 2 of which were in solitary confinement, highlighted the extreme consequences of overcrowding, systemic neglect, and the prison's complex social hierarchies. Despite the varying environments, a common thread emerged across these global institutions: control through fear, scarcity, and hierarchical manipulation. Whether in ADX Florence, La Sabaneta, Angola, or Antanimera, survival depended on understanding the unspoken rules, navigating alliances, and avoiding the consequences of breaking the rigid structures imposed by gangs or the institution itself. By the end of Chapter 3, tension reached a new height. In La Sabaneta, a fight broke out in Block B over the last ration of beans. According to news reports, several inmates were injured, while guards stood by, intervening only when the violence threatened to escalate beyond control. In ADX Florence, meanwhile, investigators monitoring a high-profile inmate noticed coded messages in correspondence with outside contacts, a subtle reminder that even the most secure prisons could not fully contain influence, power, and control. Across continents, the stakes were rising, and survival required cunning, compliance, and a careful balance between loyalty and self-preservation. Riot, rebellion, and the price of survival. The morning sun barely touched the outer walls of Carandiru Penitentiary in São Paulo, Brazil, once home to more than 8,000 inmates. According to Human Rights Watch and Brazilian Ministry of Justice reports, the prison was notorious for overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and pervasive gang influence. On one day in 1992, tensions boiled over, culminating in the infamous Carandiru massacre, where police entered the prison to quell a riot. The clash resulted in 111 inmate deaths, the largest prison massacre in Latin American history, documented and widely reported by Reuters and Amnesty International. Guards and authorities cited overcrowding and lack of control as catalysts for the violence. Inside the surviving blocks, gang hierarchies had only solidified. Members of Comando Vermelho, Red Command, and Primeiro Comando da Capital, PCC, controlled corridors and access to food, water, and even improvised weapons. According to Human Rights Watch, smaller factions aligned themselves with these dominant groups to avoid assaults or extortion. New inmates were immediately forced to negotiate their survival, often through compliance, forced labor, or providing information. Hunger, disease, and violence created a constant pressure cooker, where minor infractions could escalate to life-threatening situations. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, La Santé prison in Paris, France, revealed a different yet equally harsh struggle. Although smaller in scale, verified reports from Amnesty International and Le Monde noted that overcrowding, unsanitary cells, and underpaid staff contributed to daily tension. Fights between rival inmates erupted frequently, and access to medical care was inconsistent. Food shortages, sometimes lasting multiple days, left inmates reliant on family parcels or bribery to obtain nutrition. The prison's internal hierarchies functioned similarly to South American facilities, with stronger inmates asserting control over weaker ones. In Venezuela's Tocaron prison, conditions continued to deteriorate. Verified accounts from Reuters and local NGOs documented recurring riots over food shortages. One incident in 2019 involved a clash in Block D between prisoners vying for a small supply of rice and beans. Guards, often complicit or bribed, only intervened after severe injuries occurred. Inmates described the chaos as a war for survival, highlighting how scarcity magnified the power of gang leaders while placing ordinary prisoners in constant jeopardy. In ADX Florence, control was maintained differently, yet tension simmered beneath the surface. Solitary confinement prevented physical rebellions, but court filings and investigative reports show that inmates attempted to communicate through coded letters and legal correspondence. While the prison was technologically secure, the psychological warfare between isolated prisoners was intense. Mental strain led to episodes of self-harm and anxiety, a reminder that extreme isolation could be as dangerous as physical violence elsewhere. La Modelo prison in Bogotá, Colombia, illustrated the international scale of prison violence. According to ANADC and Colombian news sources, overcrowding and gang influence made daily life deadly. In 2020, reports documented a riot in the high-security wings where rival factions clashed over smuggled contraband and access to food. Multiple injuries occurred, and the prison's administration struggled to contain the violence. Survival depended on alliances and the ability to anticipate both gang and guard actions, reinforcing the universal lesson: power, fear, and scarcity dictated the rhythm of prison life. Even in Angola Prison, Louisiana, the legacy of violence continued. The Angola Three's decades in solitary confinement highlighted the psychological consequences of extreme punishment. Meanwhile, reports from the Vera Institute of Justice show that internal gangs controlled labor assignments, access to food, and social hierarchies. Inmate compliance with gang leaders often ensured survival, while resistance could lead to brutal retaliation or denial of necessities. Guards relied on this hierarchy to maintain order, effectively outsourcing internal control to prisoners themselves. Across continents, the pattern was consistent. Overcrowding, scarce resources, and hierarchical enforcement created fertile ground for riots, rebellion, and deadly conflict. Inmates learned to navigate complex social structures, where knowledge, alliances, and fear determined who survived. Whether in Brazil, Venezuela, Madagascar, or the United States, documented events show that food, water, and protection were as much currency as money itself, and failure to comply with established power structures often carried lethal consequences. Escape, corruption, and the limits of control. In the high-altitude isolation of ADX Florence, every movement was monitored. Cameras tracked every step, guards checked every corner, and doors were reinforced with steel so thick that even sledgehammers would struggle. Despite this, court filings and investigative reports show that inmates continued to attempt subtle forms of escape, not through physical breaches but via manipulation of the system. In one documented case, inmates attempted to exploit legal correspondence and procedural loopholes to coordinate with associates outside, an operation foiled by federal investigators. The facility's extreme security prevented conventional breakout attempts, but control could not fully neutralize influence over external criminal networks. Thousands of miles away, La Modelo Prison in Bogotá, Colombia, demonstrated a different type of challenge. According to UNADC reports and Colombian news sources, escape attempts often relied on bribery and insider knowledge. Guards, underpaid and overworked, were sometimes complicit, accepting payments in exchange for leaving gates unlocked or providing tools. In 2018, a documented incident involved several inmates breaching a poorly secured perimeter wall using improvised tools. The escape failed, but the event highlighted the vulnerabilities created by corruption and the constant interplay of fear, survival, and incentive. Meanwhile, Venezuela's Tocaron prison operated under an informal governance system led by PRANs, the prison gang leaders. Verified reports from Amnesty International and Reuters indicate that these leaders controlled not only food and protection but also movement within the prison. Attempts to escape were almost always sanctioned or blocked by these internal authorities. Any unauthorized attempt risked violent retaliation. One incident in 2019 documented a failed escape where an inmate was severely beaten by his peers before guards intervened, a stark reminder that inmate power sometimes eclipsed official authority. In Angola Prison, Louisiana, survival often meant navigating labor, hierarchy, and influence. Reports from the Vera Institute of Justice show that inmate leaders managed assignments to ensure compliance and maintain order. Escapes were nearly impossible physically, but prisoners sometimes leveraged favors or manipulations to move within restricted areas or gain privileges. In one documented case, a group of inmates petitioned successfully for transfer to less restrictive units, demonstrating how cunning and negotiation were as critical as brute strength in these maximum security environments. Across Brazil's penitentiaries, including the notorious Carandiru, escape attempts and riots were intertwined with corruption and fear. According to Human Rights Watch and Reuters, guards were often bribed to overlook lapses, sometimes facilitating coordinated attempts by gangs to smuggle in tools or contraband. One verified case from 2015 involved prisoners creating a tunnel that collapsed during excavation, leaving several severely injured. The failed escape underscored the lethal consequences of desperate survival measures in facilities plagued by overcrowding and mismanagement. In Madagascar's Antanimra prison, the scarcity of food and medical care created an environment where cooperation and subterfuge were essential. Reports from the UN and Amnesty International describe how inmates negotiated internally to avoid assaults and secure daily necessities. Escape attempts were rare due to physical barriers and geographic isolation, but creative survival strategies, such as forming protective alliances or performing tasks for more powerful prisoners, became a daily means of staying alive. Hunger, disease, and overcrowding amplified both ingenuity and desperation. Even in Europe, maximum security prisons like La Santé in Paris faced challenges with control and corruption. Investigative reports from Le Monde noted that underpaid guards and systemic inefficiencies allowed certain inmates to circumvent restrictions, sometimes creating temporary advantages or access to prohibited areas. These incidents rarely resulted in physical escape, but they demonstrated how institutional weaknesses could be exploited to gain temporary reprieve from oppressive conditions. By mid-chapter, it became evident that the most secure prisons were not infallible. Across continents, the combination of overcrowding, scarcity, and human ambition created cracks in the system. Inmates who understood these dynamics, through observation, negotiation, or alliances, could temporarily bend rules to their favor. In La Sabaneta, a gang leader brokered a deal to redistribute scarce rice supplies to allies, subtly reinforcing loyalty and consolidating power. At ADX Florence, prisoners meticulously documented procedures, waiting for legal opportunities to challenge restrictions. Each scenario illustrated the universal truth. Even in the world's most secure prisons, control is never absolute. Punishment, psychological strain, and the breaking point. Subscribe to witness the most harrowing realities behind bars. Like, comment, and follow for true crime investigations based on verified reports. The sterile, echoing corridors of ADX Florence offered no comfort. Solitary confinement, as detailed in federal court filings and investigative reports, confined inmates to 23-hour days with minimal human contact. Lights remained on for long periods, surveillance cameras tracked every move, and interaction with guards was transactional and highly controlled. Reports indicate that this extreme isolation led to widespread psychological strain, including anxiety, depression, and self-harm attempts among high-profile prisoners. In one documented instance, an inmate required intervention after prolonged sensory deprivation led to disorientation and erratic behavior. These extreme conditions, while designed for security, often tested the very limits of human endurance. Across the Atlantic, La Santé prison in Paris faced its own challenges with psychological stress among inmates. According to Amnesty International and Le Monde, overcrowding, poor hygiene, and insufficient mental health care contributed to heightened tension. Documented incidents included stabbings, fights over scarce resources, and near-riot conditions in high-security wings. Prisoners were forced to navigate complex hierarchies to avoid violence while coping with constant stress and fear. Guards reported that inmates displayed aggressive behavior not out of inherent malice but as a direct response to sustained environmental pressure. In Brazil's Carandiru Penitentiary, reports from Human Rights Watch detail both psychological and physical consequences of systemic neglect. The 1992 massacre illustrated the deadly combination of overcrowding, poorly trained guards, and inmate desperation. Even decades later, former prisoners described chronic trauma, recurring nightmares, and mistrust toward authority. Within the prison, gang leaders maintained strict control, often enforcing punishment through beatings or deprivation of food. Surviving inmates learned that any misstep could lead to physical harm or social exile, compounding the daily psychological burden. Meanwhile, Venezuela's Tocaron prison demonstrated the lethal consequences of informal governance systems. According to Reuters and Amnesty International reports, PRANs, inmate leaders, often imposed punishments ranging from deprivation of meals to severe beatings. Inmates attempting to bypass gang authority risked immediate retaliation, creating an atmosphere of constant stress and fear. Psychological pressure was amplified by the scarcity of basic needs, where even access to clean water could be contingent on compliance with internal rules. Survival demanded not only physical endurance but an acute awareness of social dynamics and potential threat. In Angola Prison, Louisiana, extreme punishments combined with forced labor imposed both physical and mental strain. Reports from the Vera Institute of Justice highlight instances where inmates subjected to solitary confinement for disciplinary reasons experienced lasting psychological effects, including anxiety, paranoia, and depression. Simultaneously, internal gang dynamics dictated access to work, food, and social standing. Inmates had to carefully navigate alliances, performing favors and enforcing hierarchies to avoid both official punishment and peer retaliation. In Madagascar's Antanimra prison, overcrowding and lack of medical care created another layer of psychological stress. UN and Amnesty International reports documented prisoners enduring months with minimal nutrition and exposure to disease outbreaks, including cholera and tuberculosis. Small incidents like fights over food or water could escalate rapidly into life-threatening situations, forcing inmates to remain vigilant at all times. The constant threat of violence and scarcity reshaped daily behavior, enforcing a survivalist mindset where mental acuity was as critical as physical strength. Even Rikers Island in New York City faced a combination of psychological and systemic strain. The prolonged pre-trial detention of young inmates, as reported by ACLU and the New York Times, revealed the destructive effects of solitary confinement and overcrowding. Khalif Browder's case, held for 3 years without trial, 2 in isolation, became a global example of the mental toll of systemic failure. Reports indicate that similar conditions fostered aggression, anxiety, and behavioral deterioration among detainees, often escalating minor disputes into severe confrontations. By the end of Chapter 6, one pattern was undeniable. Across continents, maximum security and high-risk prisons subjected inmates to extreme psychological and physical pressures. Hunger, disease, overcrowding, corruption, and fear formed a relentless cycle of strain, where both documented riots and small daily punishments contributed to lasting trauma. Guards, administrators, and inmate leaders alike reinforced the same reality. Control came at the cost of human endurance, and survival required constant vigilance, strategic alliances, and the ability to endure stress that would overwhelm most people outside the prison walls. The chapter closes with a chilling, fact-based observation. In La Sabaneta and Tocaron, documented reports describe inmates lying awake at night, rationing thought, fear, and movement to survive the coming day. The walls, thick with decay and desperation, held the weight of countless strategies for survival, each contingent on obeying or manipulating the invisible hierarchies imposed by hunger, power, and fear. Confrontation, control, and the aftermath. The tension in La Sabaneta prison, Venezuela, had reached a breaking point. Overcrowded cells, corrupt guards, and scarce resources had created an environment where survival depended on both strategy and brute force. According to Amnesty International and Reuters reports, a violent confrontation erupted in 2019 when rival factions of the PRANs clashed over control of a critical supply of food and contraband. Inmates armed with improvised weapons engaged in a prolonged brawl, resulting in multiple injuries. Guards, often complicit or overpowered, intervened only after the violence had escalated. This riot was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern verified in multiple investigations, demonstrating the lethal consequences of unchecked internal hierarchies. Across the Atlantic, Carandiru prison's shadow lingered long after its closure in 2002. Reports from Human Rights Watch highlight that post-riot investigations revealed systemic failures, poorly trained staff, overcrowded conditions, and the absence of proper medical care contributed to preventable fatalities. Surviving inmates reported long-term trauma, loss of trust, and entrenched fear. The lessons drawn from Carandiru underscore a recurring theme across high-risk prisons worldwide. When resources are scarce and authority is compromised, violence becomes inevitable. In ADX Florence, the United States maximum security federal prison, interventions were more controlled but no less critical. Investigators, using internal reports and court filings, observed that inmates sometimes attempted subtle manipulations of the system. One documented incident involved correspondence intended to coordinate external influence over criminal networks. Guards intercepted the communication, averting what could have escalated into a larger security breach. While the physical environment prevented riots, the psychological and legal strategies employed by prisoners demonstrated that influence extended far beyond physical barriers. Meanwhile, in Antanimra prison, Madagascar, international observers reported the aftermath of recurring skirmishes over food, water, and bed allocations. According to UN and Amnesty International reports, interventions included limited medical aid, external oversight, and occasional redistribution of resources, but systemic issues persisted. Inmates who survived had learned to navigate both the visible authority of guards and the hidden power of internal hierarchies. The psychological impact of constant threat shaped every decision, from whom to ally with to how to negotiate scarce resources. Back in Angola prison, Louisiana, documented reports from the Vera Institute of Justice revealed that gang-led labor control and informal punishment systems continued to enforce internal discipline. Inmates complied with orders to avoid injury, starvation, or solitary confinement. Administrative oversight often relied on inmate leaders to maintain order, highlighting a paradox. The very prisoners most feared by authorities were instrumental in sustaining daily operations. Survival required a delicate balance of compliance, strategic alliances, and constant vigilance. In La Santé prison in Paris, France, staff faced daily challenges managing small-scale riots and violent dispute. According to verified sources, minor altercations often escalated due to overcrowding, poor hygiene, and insufficient staffing. Interventions ranged from temporary lockdowns to medical assistance for injured inmates. The repeated need for intervention emphasized how structural failures amplified the psychological and physical strain on both staff and inmates, reinforcing the universality of these challenges across the globe. Even in Rikers Island, New York City, the aftermath of violence and failed containment strategies echoed internationally. Following documented incidents of assault, contraband smuggling, and solitary confinement abuse, investigations highlighted systemic neglect. The case of Khalif Browder, held 3 years without trial and 2 in isolation, exemplified the psychological toll of mismanagement and the lethal consequences of prolonged inhumane conditions. ACLU reports emphasize that structural reform and smaller, better supervised facilities were essential to prevent repeated tragedies. By the end of Chapter 7, a clear pattern emerged across continents. Control, survival, and intervention were in constant tension. Whether through violent riots, psychological manipulation, or administrative oversight, prisons functioned as microcosms of society under extreme duress. Scarcity of resources, internal hierarchies, and corruption created conditions where survival often required negotiation, fear, and cunning. Even interventions by guards or external authorities could not fully eliminate the danger, they only shifted the balance temporarily. The chapter closes with a sobering fact from multiple verified reports. In La Sabanita, Carandiru, and Antanimra, inmates described navigating corridors where a single misstep, defying a gang leader, failing to pay a bribe, or miscalculating an alliance could result in immediate injury or death. Across high-security facilities worldwide, these documented realities illustrate that the deadliest prisons are not defined solely by walls and bars, but by the human dynamics of fear, scarcity, and survival that govern every day inside. Global failures and the struggle for reform. In Brazil, the aftermath of repeated riots in prisons like Carandiru and São Paulo penitentiaries exposed the systemic failures of the country's correctional system. According to Human Rights Watch and the Brazilian Ministry of Justice, these facilities suffered from chronic overcrowding, underpaid and understaffed guards, and minimal oversight. After the 1992 Carandiru massacre, reforms were proposed, including smaller, more controlled units and improved training for prison staff. Reuters reports indicate that while some measures were implemented, persistent corruption and gang influence continued to undermine effectiveness, creating a cycle of violence that remains evident decades later. Across Venezuela, the conditions in La Sabaneta and Tocaron have prompted repeated intervention attempts by international human rights organizations. According to Amnesty International and UN reports, proposed reforms included reducing inmate numbers, improving nutrition, and implementing better monitoring of guard conduct. Yet these efforts faced significant resistance from entrenched prison hierarchies. The PRANs, inmate leaders with extensive control over resources and punishment, often sabotage changes that threatened their authority. Even when outside aid arrived, food and medical supplies frequently failed to reach the most vulnerable, emphasizing that systemic corruption could nullify reform attempts. In Madagascar, Antanimara prison exemplifies the global struggle with overcrowding and inadequate healthcare. Reports from the United Nations and Amnesty International show that the prison frequently exceeds capacity by more than 100%, leaving inmates exposed to disease and malnutrition. Interventions by NGOs have occasionally provided relief. Food parcels, medical care, and monitoring of human rights abuses, but these remain stopgap solutions. Daily survival relies heavily on inmate alliances, negotiation, and adaptation, highlighting that true reform must address both physical infrastructure and social hierarchies inside the prison. Even in the United States, where facilities like ADX Florence, Rikers Island, and Angola are considered high security, reform remains an ongoing challenge. Court filings and investigative journalism from the New York Times, ACLU, and Vera Institute of Justice illustrate that systemic strain, overcrowding, mental health crises, and internal gang influence continues despite decades of procedural and technological improvements. For example, the mental health consequences of prolonged solitary confinement at ADX Florence have been subject to litigation, prompting gradual policy adjustments but never fully eliminating the inherent psychological strain on inmates. La Santé prison in France has similarly faced reform pressures. Verified reports from Amnesty International and Le Monde describe initiatives aimed at reducing overcrowding and improving mental health services. Despite incremental successes, structural issues like inadequate staffing and limited healthcare capacity perpetuate tension and occasional violence. Inmates continue to navigate social hierarchies for protection and survival, illustrating that reform efforts must tackle both infrastructure and human dynamics simultaneously. Across these continents, a consistent theme emerges: human factors, fear, hunger, power, and scarcity often outweigh policy reforms. Structural improvements can mitigate some dangers, but unless social hierarchies and gang influence are addressed, the day-to-day survival calculus for inmates remains largely unchanged. Reports from Reuters, UN, and Human Rights Watch emphasize that without accountability, corruption, and proper resource allocation, reforms are unlikely to prevent further crises. By the end of Chapter 8, one reality became undeniable: global prison systems share common vulnerabilities. From Brazil's Carandiru to Venezuela's Tocaron, Madagascar's Antanimara, and France's La Santé, overcrowding, scarcity, and corruption combine to produce extreme conditions. Even maximum security U.S. prisons like ADX Florence illustrate that psychological strain, isolation, and internal inmate hierarchies create ongoing challenges. Documented reforms have made some progress, but the underlying human dynamics continue to dictate the daily survival of inmates worldwide. Escapes, failures, and the limits of control. Subscribe for the shocking realities of the world's deadliest prisons. Every story is drawn from verified sources. The early morning fog hung low over Alcatraz Island, California, a place long celebrated as inescapable. Opened in 1934, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary housed some of America's most dangerous criminals. According to National Park Service reports and historical court records, the most famous escape attempt occurred in 1962 when Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers disappeared from their cells. The escape remains officially unsolved, but investigations confirm that the prisoners meticulously carved through walls, crafted life vests, and coordinated their timing, a rare example of ingenuity overcoming extreme security measures. While their ultimate fate is unknown, the event demonstrated that even The Rock was not invulnerable. Across the globe in Brazil, Papuda Penitentiary in Brasilia faced its own challenges. According to Human Rights Watch and Reuters reports, multiple escape attempts were foiled each year due to heightened gang surveillance and corruption. In one documented 2017 incident, inmates attempted to dig a tunnel beneath the prison courtyard. Guards discovered the excavation before it could succeed, but the event highlighted the ingenuity and desperation of prisoners in overcrowded facilities. Even with high walls, cameras, and trained personnel, the combination of human ingenuity and systemic gaps created opportunities for bold, albeit rare, escape attempts. In Venezuela, Tocaron prison presented another extreme. Verified reports from Amnesty International and Reuters indicate that small-scale escape attempts occasionally occurred despite strict plans overseeing daily operations. One 2018 incident involved a prisoner attempting to climb the exterior wall using improvised rope. Fellow inmates, loyal to the prison hierarchy, alerted guards, preventing the escape and punishing the would-be escapee severely. This illustrates a consistent pattern. In prisons with strong internal hierarchies, inmate-enforced control often exceeds official authority, making independent escapes nearly impossible. Meanwhile, in ADX Florence, Colorado, physical escape is virtually impossible. Court filings and investigative journalism show that the only viable form of escape is psychological or administrative. Inmates manipulate legal procedures, correspondence, or procedural loopholes to influence the outside world. One documented case involved a federal inmate coordinating with attorneys to delay legal deadlines, subtly exerting influence beyond the facility's walls. These rare successes underscore that even in a supermax environment, absolute control is theoretical, not practical. In Madagascar's Antanimra prison, reports from the United Nations and Amnesty International indicate that escape attempts are extremely rare due to geographic isolation and structural weaknesses. Instead, survival relies on internal navigation of power hierarchies, maintaining alliances, and negotiating with stronger inmates to avoid violence. While no major escapes were verified in recent years, multiple minor incidents were reported, such as inmates exploiting lapses in supervision to temporarily leave assigned areas without authorization. Each incident demonstrates that control is never absolute, but risks are tightly managed. In Angola Prison, Louisiana, historical data and reports from the Vera Institute of Justice highlight that large-scale escapes are almost non-existent due to extreme security and physical barriers. However, some prisoners have leveraged administrative procedures to gain privileges or transfers to lower security areas, a form of indirect escape from extreme confinement. Such cases show that while physical barriers prevent mass escapes, human negotiation and cunning remain factors in survival and control. Even Rikers Island, New York City, has witnessed small-scale breaches despite high population density and surveillance. According to ACLU and New York Times reports, inmates have exploited overcrowding and understaffed areas to temporarily evade control within the facility. These events are usually short-lived and rarely involve permanent escape, but they reveal persistent vulnerabilities in even well-established correctional systems. By the end of Chapter 9, a universal truth emerges from every facility examined. Security measures, surveillance, and physical barriers are only as effective as the human element allows. Whether in historic Alcatraz, Supermax ADX Florence, or overcrowded Tokaran and Antanimera, inmates demonstrate ingenuity, patience, and risk-taking in rare but verified instances. Control is never total. The most secure prisons in the world face constant challenges, balancing surveillance, human ingenuity, and the ever-present drive for freedom. Aftermath, ongoing crises, and the human cost. Subscribe to uncover the full reality of the world's deadliest prisons. Every account is verified and fact-based. Across continents, the legacy of extreme confinement, overcrowding, and systemic corruption continues to shape the daily realities of prisoners. In Venezuela, Tokaran and La Sabanita remain under intense scrutiny by international organizations. According to Amnesty International and Reuters reports, conditions are still dire. Insufficient food, limited medical care, and pervasive gang hierarchies define daily life. While sporadic reforms have been attempted, entrenched prans and corrupt guards continue to enforce control through violence and intimidation. Survivors of riots and beatings recount lasting trauma, emphasizing the psychological cost of life inside these high-risk facilities. In Brazil, despite Carandira's closure, overcrowding and gang influence remain endemic in many state prisons. Human Rights Watch and Ministry of Justice reports highlight the recurring cycles of violence, riots, and failed reform efforts. Small-scale structural improvements, such as subdividing cells and implementing monitoring programs, have reduced some immediate risks but have not addressed the root causes: systemic corruption, poverty-driven inmate recruitment, and insufficient staffing. Former prisoners report long-term PTSD, mistrust, and fear of retaliation even after release, revealing how the prison environment leaves a lasting imprint on human lives. The United States presents a contrasting but equally sobering picture. ADX Florence, Angola, and Rikers Island, though structurally secure, still demonstrate the limitations of purely physical security. Court filings, investigative journalism, and NGO reports show that mental health issues, gang influence, and systemic neglect create conditions where control is fragile. Khalif Browder's case at Rikers Island remains emblematic. His prolonged solitary confinement and eventual suicide brought national attention to the psychological toll of institutional failure. Similarly, at ADX Florence, decades of extreme isolation have sparked legal challenges and ongoing debate about ethical imprisonment practices. In Madagascar, Antanimera prison continues to struggle with overcrowding and disease. UN and Amnesty International reports indicate that even with international monitoring, structural deficiencies and inadequate healthcare persist. Inmates navigate daily survival through informal hierarchies and alliances, mirroring patterns seen in Venezuela, Brazil, and the United States. The physical conditions alone, from contaminated water to overcrowded cells, combine with social power dynamics to create a lethal environment where even minor disputes can escalate into serious harm. Across Europe, La Santé prison in Paris continues to implement reforms to reduce overcrowding and improve mental health care. Verified sources from Le Monde and Amnesty International highlight that while progress has been made, the pressure of maintaining security in dense, high-risk populations remains. The underlying human dynamics, fear, scarcity, and the need for hierarchy, cannot be eliminated entirely, illustrating that structural reforms are only part of the solution. Despite differences in geography, culture, and governance, one reality unites these institutions. Prison is not only about containment but about managing human behavior under extreme conditions. Scarcity, fear, and hierarchical control govern every aspect of daily life, from food distribution to access to medical care. Inmates must navigate these dynamics continually, balancing alliances, compliance, and resistance to survive. This fact-based pattern repeats from Venezuela to Madagascar, Brazil to the United States, and Europe alike. The aftermath of life inside these prisons is profound. Former inmates report lasting psychological trauma, health consequences from malnutrition and disease, and deep social scars. Families of prisoners continue to struggle with the secondary effects of incarceration: economic hardship, social stigma, and fear for loved ones still behind bars. International oversight and advocacy provide some relief, but systemic issues remain entrenched. Reports from the United Nations, Amnesty International, Reuters, Human Rights Watch, and the ACLU consistently underscore that these facilities are not anomalies. They are indicative of broader failures in prison management worldwide. Chapter 10 closes on a sobering, fact-based reflection. The world's deadliest prisons are defined not solely by walls, barbed wire, or steel doors, but by the intersecting forces of hunger, disease, fear, corruption, and social hierarchy. Even the most secure and technologically advanced facilities cannot eliminate the human realities of survival, manipulation, and resilience. Inmates endure daily battles that test both body and mind, and the aftermath leaves enduring consequences for prisoners, families, and society. The final scene fades on a solitary corridor in Tocaron, Venezuela. A prisoner carefully divides the last portion of spoiled rice among his allies, each aware that a misstep could be fatal. Across oceans and continents, the echoes of similar struggles resonate, a universal truth. The deadliest prisons are measured not only by security, but by the human cost of surviving within them.